This is a recording of Chapter 10, Soil and Food. Many people around the world suffer from chronic hunger, which is also called undernutrition, as well as malnutrition. Food security means having daily access to enough nutritious food so that someone can live an active and healthy life. One of every 6 people in countries that are considered less developed experiences food insecurity. The main cause of food insecurity is poverty. There were other reasons for insecurity for food, such as political upheaval, war, corruption, and bad weather. People need to consume large amounts of what we call macronutrients. That includes carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And then we need smaller amounts of micronutrients. That includes vitamins and minerals such as vitamin A, iron, and iodine. Malnutrition is when there's a deficiency of protein and other key nutrients, and this could make someone weaker and more vulnerable to diseases. It could also hinder the normal development of children. So, a key indicator of malnourishment is rates of children under the age 5 that have stunted growth. So if we see Ethiopia, Zambia, India, Bangladesh, Peru, and Brazil, and then the numbers are in percentage. So over 50% of children under the age of 5 living in Ethiopia have stunted growth. So that is a metric of malnourishment. And then you can see Brazil has less than 10% in that category of stunted growth. And then from the opposite side of the spectrum, many people have health problems from eating too much, and that's overnutrition. So that is when food intake exceeds the energy used by a person. And that could lead to excess body fat, and it could actually lead to similar health problems as those suffering from undernutrition. So lower life expectancy, greater susceptibility to diseases and illnesses. Globally, about 1 billion people have health problems because they do not get enough to eat. And about 1.6 billion people face health problems from eating too much. I think the statistic here is astounding. About 69% of American adults are in the overweight category, and half of those are in the obese category. And that is based on the body mass index, which you can look up and see. It goes by height and weight, and then there's categories for what is considered overweight and obese, as well as underweight and in the normal weight category. Obesity plays a role in 1 in 5 deaths in the United States from heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and some forms of cancer. Then we will discuss food production related to crops, meat and dairy, and fish. About 10,000 years ago, humans began shifting from hunting and gathering to growing food and raising animals for food and labor. Today, three systems supply most of our food. That is going to include croplands, rangelands, pastures, and feedlots, and fisheries and aquaculture. So crops is going to be mostly grains. The rangelands, pastures, and feedlots is mostly meat and dairy. And fisheries and aquaculture is seafood. And food production has increased dramatically over time. Since 1960, global food production has increased, and this is due to technological advances. That includes new improved methods of farming, better machinery, better equipment, using computers and satellites. And there was an episode on the TV show 60 Minutes where they interviewed the CEO of Land O'Lakes, and she discussed the use of satellites and computers to increase the production of dairy. And I have the link here if you want to see more information. Other technological advances include improvements to fishing, so fishing equipment using more technology. Also, the development of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, the development of crops that can give a higher yield. So those would be genetically modified organisms. And technology related to fish farming and feedlots. So then we're going to focus on agriculture. And there were two different categories of agriculture, which is growing crops. So the two types include traditional agriculture and industrialized agriculture. And first, I want to focus in on the modern industrialized agriculture. So industrialized agriculture requires high inputs, and that includes using heavy equipment, large amounts of money, which partly goes into the equipment, but also fuels, water, chemicals. The fuels are going to be fossil fuels. And we also have commercially produced chemicals, including inorganic fertilizers and pesticides. And all of these inputs go into producing single crops. We call this monoculture. For example, one farm that grows soybeans or another farm that grows corn. So monoculture is a single crop that a farm is growing. The main goal of industrialized agriculture is to increase crop yield. Crop yield is the amount of food produced per unit of land. Industrialized agriculture is mostly used in the more industrialized countries, the more developed countries, and it produces about 80% of the world's food. And then a subcategory of industrialized agriculture is plantation agriculture. And that is specifically used in tropical, less developed countries. And that involves growing what we call cash crops. And that would include bananas, soybeans, sugarcane, coffee, palm oil, and vegetables. Crops in a plantation agriculture system are grown on large plantations of monoculture And then mostly the crops are exported to more developed countries. This land in this photo used to be covered with tropical rainforest. And then the creation of the plantation drastically reduced the biodiversity in the area. So you take a tropical rainforest, which has lots of different types of plants, animals, various different organisms, and you're replacing that with one type of plant. In this case, it is oil palm trees. And then palm oil is exported in large amounts to developed countries, where it is used in processed foods like snacks, as well as cosmetic products. So is industrialized agriculture sustainable? It is considered environmentally unsustainable. And that is due to it relying heavily on fossil fuels, reducing the biodiversity, for example, cutting down forests or destroying grasslands in order to replace those ecosystems with a monoculture farm, as well as disrupting nutrient cycles. Let's take a look at traditional agriculture. So traditional agriculture provides about 20% of the world's food crops, mostly in less developed countries. And traditional agriculture relies on natural inputs. That includes sunlight, animal manure as fertilizer, water, and human and animal labor. And you see up here, this is an example. You have a couple of horses pulling this equipment with this farmer sitting on it. So you're not using fossil fuels, you're using animal labor. Traditional agriculture produces small crop yields, and that's going to be enough crops for a family and then maybe a little bit extra food for them to sell to get income. But these are not going to be large scale farms. They're not plantations. It's more subsistence farming. So traditional agriculture is more sustainable than industrialized agriculture. Traditional agriculture, again, requires a low input of resources. It maintains a higher level of biodiversity of the land because traditional agriculture is usually going to involve growing more than one type of crop on the farmland. And we call that polyculture. And that's when you grow multiple crops on the same land. And growing multiple crops increases the biodiversity of the farm. And when you increase the crop diversity on the farm, it reduces the chance of losing all of the year's food supply when you have pests or bad weather. And that's because different plants react differently. You might have some pests that are more focused on a particular type of plant, and they may not really destroy another type of plant as much. So then at least you'll have some plants that you can salvage some food from. Also, different crops mature and are harvested at different times. So this provides food throughout the year, and it keeps part of the soil covered with crops for longer. So while you are harvesting one crop, one part of the year, you will have other crops that are growing on other parts of the farm. And this helps reduce soil erosion from wind and water by keeping the soil covered for longer periods of time. Insecticides and herbicides are rarely needed because the farm creates a habitat for natural predators of insects that eat crops. And weeds have trouble competing with the many plants on the farm. Polyculture farms will end up producing higher yields of crops than monoculture plantations. So let's discuss how to increase crop yields. In order to increase yields, farmers can either farm on additional land or get higher yields from their existing cropland. So the Green Revolution is a revolution, not really a revolution, but we're calling it the Green Revolution. So since 1950, most of the increase in global food production has come from industrialized agriculture. And that is related to the use of high inputs of fertilizer and pesticides, as well as using varieties of crops that are higher yield. So the first part of the Green Revolution, or the first Green Revolution, is the industrialization of agriculture. And that occurred between 1950 and 1970. And high yields of crops resulted from having high inputs. And this was mainly in more developed countries, such as the US. And this includes key crops such as rice, wheat, and corn, and crops that were engineered to be high yield. And the inputs include large quantities of synthetic inorganic fertilizers and pesticides, fuel, and water. A second green revolution has been taking place since 1967, and that is characterized by monoculture of crops such as rice and wheat that have been specially bred for tropical and subtropical climates. And that is in less developed countries such as India, China, and Brazil. So that's more the plantation monoculture. So the results of the green revolutions are that since 1950, yields of crops such as wheat, corn, and soybeans have more than doubled. And that is all without having to cultivate additional land. Now, people directly consume about 48% of the world's grain production. And about 35% of that grain is fed to livestock. And the remaining 17%, which is mostly corn, is used to make biofuels such as ethanol. So next time you go to a gas station, look for a sign that says ethanol. That is a biofuel made from corn. And the sign at the gas station will say something like what percentage ethanol is in your gasoline. In the US, industrialized farming has evolved into an agribusiness. And that is a small number of giant multinational corporations, such as ConAgra, that control the growing, the processing, distribution, and the sale of food in the US as well as global markets. Next, we will go over organic agriculture. Organic agriculture is when crops are grown without the use of synthetic pesticides and inorganic fertilizers or genetic engineering. Furthermore, animals must be raised on 100% organic feed without the use of antibiotics or growth hormones. The next topic is crossbreeding and genetic engineering of crops and livestock. Crossbreeding through artificial selection or selective breeding has been used for centuries by farmers and scientists to develop genetically improved varieties of crops. For example, corn, as well as livestock animals. Such selective breeding in this first gene revolution has yielded amazing results. For example, corn that we eat today was adapted from a Mexican wild grass. As you can see on the top, that is a picture of what the original corn looked like. And it was selectively bred over many, many, many years to be the large cob of corn that we are familiar with today, or the large ear of corn. As you can see on the left, you have these little tiny ear of corn. That is the original grass that the ear of corn that we're used to today came from. And they do that through selective breeding. So if you have some plants that have a little bit of a larger ear of corn, then you would breed that with other plants that might have slightly larger ears of corn. And then over time, you keep on breeding whichever plants yield a larger ear of corn until you end up with this large corn that we're used to seeing today. So that is an example of how selective breeding works. And again, that's artificial selection because people are selecting what to breed together. There has been a second gene revolution, and that is through science of genetic engineering. And that is a method of developing new organisms with desirable traits. So genetic engineering involves adding, deleting, or changing segments of DNA of an organism. And the goal is to produce desirable traits or to eliminate undesirable traits. And that's done through gene splicing. You splice the gene and can remove the undesirable genes. And the result is an organism that we call a genetically modified organism, or GMO. And creating new crop varieties through gene splicing is faster than selective breeding. It usually costs less and allows for the insertion of genes from almost any other organism into crop cells. So when you could cut apart DNA and pick and choose the traits that you want, and then you can insert traits using DNA from other organisms, you are able to create organisms with desirable traits. bioengineers plan on developing new genetically modified crops that are resistant to things like heat or cold, resistant to herbicides, insects, parasites, viral diseases, drought, and poor soil conditions, such as salty or acidic soil. And the hope would be to have these crops that are new and engineered be able to grow faster and not need as much irrigated water and not need as much fertilizer and pesticides. The Flavor Saver tomato was the first genetically engineered food to reach the public. It was approved in 1994, and it was genetically modified by injecting flounder genes, like the fish, flounder, into a tomato so that the tomato was able to last in cold temperatures. This particular tomato did not hold up in shipping, and consumers did not like it, and it was eventually taken off the market. Currently, at least 80% of the food on US supermarket shelves contains some form of genetically engineered food or ingredients, but there are no laws right now that require the labeling of genetically modified foods. Some brands have started labeling their foods, though, where there'll be a sentence that says something like contains genetically modified ingredients or something like that. If brands do not label their food as being non-GMO, then what we can do is rely on certified organic food. Organic food cannot use genetically modified seeds or ingredients. So if a food product is labeled 100% organic or USDA certified organic, then it will not have genetically modified ingredients. There is controversy over genetically engineered food. Proponents say that genetically modifying food is potentially a sustainable way to solve the world's hunger problems and improve human health. Critics warn that we know too little about the long-term potential harm to human health and ecosystems from using GMOs, and that GM organisms released into the environment may cause some unintended harmful genetic and ecological effects. Genes in plant pollen from genetically modified crops can spread among non-engineered species. For example, wind could blow pollen onto a nearby farm, and then new strains can form hybrids with wild crop varieties, and that could potentially reduce the natural genetic biodiversity of the wild strains. Another potential issue is that a woman went into anaphylactic shock after eating enchiladas, potentially because of a severe allergic reaction to Starlink, a gene-modified corn, which was not approved for human consumption. It was only meant for animal feed. But somehow it ended up being used to make taco shells, which were then recalled. So it's possible that her anaphylactic shock was related to eating this Starlink corn. So that is potentially a very big problem, but it was recalled. And that was from 2000. There's a link to an article down here. Also, In the documentary called The Future of Food, they go into this in more detail as well. Meat production is the next topic, and that includes any meat and animal products, eggs, milk, and any meat. Between 1961 and 2012, world meat production, mostly beef, pork, and poultry, increased more than fourfold. The average meat consumption per person more than doubled. Global meat production is likely to more than double again by 2050 as more people begin consuming more meat and animal products in rapidly developing countries such as China and India. About 1/2 of the world's meat comes from livestock grazing on grass, for example, in rangelands or pastures. The other half of the world's meat is produced through industrialized systems in which animals are raised mostly in crowded feedlots and concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. In the industrialized system of meat production, the animals are fed grain, fish meal, fish oil, growth hormones, and antibiotics. And the animals are bred to gain weight quickly. There are significant environmental impacts on air and water, including from animal wastes running off into local waterways. On the top picture is figure 10.6, a concentrated chicken feeding operation in Iowa. Buildings like this can house up to 100,000 chickens. And then at the bottom is figure 10.5. On this cattle feedlot in western Texas, thousands of cattle are fattened on grain for a few months before being slaughtered. If anybody is a vegetarian or vegan, I apologize. Industrialized meat production, harmful consequences versus benefits. So some benefits of industrialized meat production. It allows for an increase in meat production and reduces overgrazing of ranches and pastures. Also, it is profitable. And it makes meat more affordable. It increases consumption of meat for people who may not have been able to afford it otherwise. And then there are harmful environmental consequences, such as large amounts of energy and water are needed, and the energy is fossil fuels. Huge amounts of animal waste are produced, and then the animal waste may pollute the air and water, and that's mainly from runoff of animal waste into local waterways. And greenhouse gas emissions, for example, methane that comes from animals. Basically, the animals are passing gas, like flatulate. And also the animal waste will release methane. And then the burning of fossil fuels is also going to emit greenhouse gases. This is a photo of a waste lagoon. So feedlots and CAFOs, sometimes they'll have, well, most of the time, they'll have a pit that is called a waste lagoon, and animal waste is dumped into this lagoon. And then as it decomposes, it releases methane to the atmosphere. Industrialized livestock production generates about 18% of the world's greenhouse gases. And therefore, agriculture, with its burning of fossil fuels in the use of equipment, industrialized meat production, releasing methane, and then also equipment burning fossil fuels and releasing carbon dioxide. And then also the machinery used to process the food, as well as the vehicles that run on fossil fuels that are used to transport the food. All of that combined, the food production creates a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So there is a farmer named Lloyd Bryant in North Carolina who began using a system that processed waste from his hog farm, and it turned manure into electricity, and then created usable forms of fertilizer in the form of manure, right? Animal manure can be used as fertilizer. And it is a way of using methane that comes from the waste on the farm as an energy source instead of allowing it to go into the atmosphere and add to the greenhouse gases. And the methane ultimately is burned in order to run a turbine, which produces electricity. So this is an example of something that can be used on a greater scale. Perhaps other farms can install systems like this as well. And maybe there is some hope in lessening the impacts of greenhouse gases that come from food production, at least from this aspect of dealing with the animal waste, the methane specifically. A fourth harmful environmental consequence of industrialized meat production is the widespread use of antibiotics. 70% of the antibiotics that are used in the US are added to animal feed to prevent the spread of diseases in feedlots and CAFOs, and it also makes the livestock animals grow faster. This overuse of antibiotics is an important factor in the rise of antibiotic resistant bacteria. And then that will reduce the effectiveness of some antibiotics that are used to treat infectious diseases in humans. A fifth harmful environmental consequence is disruption of nutrient cycling. Worldwide, only about half of all manure is returned to the land as nutrient-rich fertilizer. So that is a disruption to the nutrient chemical cycle, nutrient and chemical cycling. And nutrient cycling is a key principle of sustainability. The rest of that manure that is not returned to the land as fertilizer can end up in polluting aquatic system, ends up polluting aquatic systems, producing foul odors and emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere as it decays. So it's definitely better to allow the manure to act as nutrient-rich fertilizer, which is the natural way nutrient cycling, and that is more sustainable. A case study about meat production and ocean dead zones. So huge amounts of synthetic inorganic fertilizers are used in the Midwestern United States to produce corn for animal feed and ethanol fuel for cars. Remember, a lot of the corn grown in this country is used for animal feed. So much of this fertilizer runs off the cropland and ends up in the Mississippi River. The added nitrate and phosphate nutrients from the fertilizer over-fertilize the coastal waters in the Gulf of Mexico at the end of the Mississippi River. Each year, this creates a dead zone where the oxygen becomes depleted by algae blooms. The algae increases due to the increasing phosphorus, and then when the algae die, they get decomposed by bacteria, and that decomposition uses up a lot of oxygen. So this whole process results in low oxygen in the coastal waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The lack of oxygen harms the aquatic organisms as well as affects the seafood production of the Gulf of Mexico, which is affecting the area of New Orleans, which is by the mouth of the Mississippi River. And seafood is a really big part of the culture in New Orleans. This just shows the drainage basin of the Mississippi River. So the Mississippi River ultimately ends in the Gulf of Mexico. So you end up with the algae blooms and the depleted oxygen off the coast. Now we're going to talk about fish and shellfish production. A fishery is an area of the ocean or a bay where an aquatic species is concentrated in large numbers. And if the numbers are large enough, it'll be worthwhile to harvest them on a commercial scale. Aquaculture is raising of fish in ponds or in underwater cages in the ocean. And here is a shrimp farm in Thailand. So that is an example of aquaculture. Overfishing, ocean pollution, and climate change may lead to a collapse of most of the world's major commercial ocean fisheries by the year 2050. Aquaculture can be harmful to aquatic ecosystems. For example, about 1/3 of wild fish that are caught from oceans is used to make fish meal and fish oil, which are then fed to farmed fish. So this can add to the depletion of many populations of wild fish. Another problem is that some fish meal and fish oil that are fed to farm-raised fish is actually contaminated with toxins such as PCBs and dioxin. Other harmful situations related to aquaculture. Fish on fish farms can escape their pens and mix with wild fish, and that could possibly disrupt the gene pools of wild fish populations. Major seed companies are pushing to use patented GMO soybeans as primary feed for farm-raised fish and shellfish. But fish that are fed soy tend to create more waste, and this will lead to more water pollution. And it could also lead to more deforestation as we need more land in order to grow soybeans. Now we're going to talk about soil erosion. Soil is related to agriculture and food, as our plants are going to grow in soil. Although you do have hydroponics where you can grow plants in water as well. But mostly our crops are grown in soil. Soil erosion is the movement of soil, especially nutrient-rich topsoil, from one place to another by wind and water. And topsoil is the fertile top layer of soil. Flowing water from rainfall is the leading cause of topsoil erosion. This photo here shows soil erosion on a farm in Tennessee. It is related to rainfall, and then you have this water that's flowing as runoff, and that is carrying away some of the topsoil, which contains nutrients. So some major harmful effects of erosion of topsoil include loss of fertility or loss of plant nutrients. Also, when the soil particles run off of a farm and ends up in local streams or other waterways, it causes water pollution. And if the soil happens to be contaminated with pesticides, then the pesticides can end up biomagnified in the food chain. And if the soil contained fertilizer, it could lead to eutrophication of the bodies of water that these soil particles end up in. This map shows where topsoil erosion is a problem. The red sections show a serious concern. The blue sections show some concern. And the white is stable or areas that don't have vegetation. Soil erosion brings us to the topic of desertification. Desertification is the expansion of deserts into formerly productive lands. Desertification can occur in areas that are semi-arid that border existing deserts. For example, grasslands, savanna, and steppes at the margins of deserts are going to be the most vulnerable to having desertification happen. Causes of desertification include drought, overgrazing by animals, deforestation, and overuse of freshwater resources. All of these factors lead to the soil drying up and crumbling and then being carried away by wind and water. In other words, soil erosion. An example is the Sahel, which is south of the Sahara Desert. That is an example of an area that is vulnerable to desertification. Drought is common, and the land can only support a limited number of people and livestock, but there is overpopulation in that area. Another example of an area that is vulnerable to desertification is Mongolia, as well as some parts of China. And you have the expansion of the Gobi Desert. Please click on these two links in the lecture to watch these two videos. Now we're going to talk about the Dust Bowl of the 1930s in the Great Plains prairies of the United States. The Great Plains prairies region is usually semi-arid grassland, and it naturally has drought-resistant grasses growing. However, a brief wet period led to people moving there and then farming the land and over-farming. And they removed native grasses that were drought-resistant and replaced those grasses with crops that required water or more water. Eventually, that brief wet period ended and the arid conditions set back in. So many crops failed and the soil dried up and was eroded away by wind. Strong westerly winds blow over much of the Great Plains, and winds that blow over flat land with low relief vegetation do not have friction to slow down the wind. So wind blowing over the plains is going to be faster than wind blowing through a forest, for example. So this unhindered wind increased soil erosion, but also the native grasses had roots that held the soil in place. So when the grasses were removed to make room for crops, it disrupted the soil protection, which was the roots holding the soil particles together. As you can see in this picture, the area of sand or soil, sandy soil, that it has the grasses in it is being held together, and there's a mound of sediment there because the roots are holding the sediment in place. The areas around the grass is lower. That's because of the removal of the sediment where it was not held down by grass. So during periods of prolonged drought, you had strong winds removing large amounts of soil from the land. And there were large dust storms in the Great Plains region in the 1930s. And because of these large dust storms, it was called the Dust Bowl. Here is a photo of a dust storm in the plains in Colorado. Dust storms were so severe at times that people could only see just a few feet in front of them. The Dust Bowl affected approximately 100 million acres in Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado, New Mexico, and Kansas. So how can we reduce desertification and restore soil fertility? It's difficult because we can't control prolonged droughts, but we can reduce methods that leave land vulnerable to soil erosion and thus the desertification. For example, we could prevent overgrazing, we could stop deforestation, we can slow projected climate change, which leads to severe and prolonged droughts. And we can restore vegetation by planting native trees and grasses. This is a video that talks about restoring the plants in the Sahel in Africa and how it helped to lessen the effects of desertification. So you can watch that video. You can access the link in the lecture notes. But this is the title if you want to just search for that title. So how do we restore soil fertility? It can be restored using fertilizers. Organic fertilizer from plant and animal materials, for example, animal manure, the waste from cattle, horses, poultry, and other farm animals, adds organic nitrogen and stimulates the growth of soil bacteria and fungi. Also, compost, which is produced when microorganisms in soil break down organic matter that comes from animal or plant materials. Organic agriculture uses only organic fertilizers as well as crop rotation to replenish nutrients. Crop rotation means that you circulate which crops you're going to grow on different parts of a farm. And that allows for nutrients to get replenished because you're not always growing the same plants in the same area indefinitely. So you are allowing for replenishment of nutrients. And here is a photo of chickens adding fertilizer to the soil on a farm in Pennsylvania. And you can have chicken coops that are mobile and move them around a farm so that the chickens are distributing manure in one part of a farm, and then you have them in another part of a farm on another day. And it's going to be evenly distributed approximately around the farm. Restoring soil fertility by using synthetic inorganic fertilizers, which are inorganic compounds containing nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. That could lead to pollution of waterways when there is fertilizer runoff. Inorganic fertilizer use has grown more than 900% since the year 1950. Synthetic inorganic fertilizers do not replace organic matter. So to completely restore nutrients to topsoil, both inorganic and organic fertilizers should be used. Now we will talk about pest control. A pest is any species that interferes with human welfare by competing with us for food, invading homes, lawns, and gardens, destroying building materials, spreading disease, invading ecosystems, or just being a nuisance. This is a photo from an article from 2020, and it shows locusts swarming across a highway in Kenya. So all of these yellowish looking things in the photo are locusts. In natural ecosystems and farms that have multiple types of crops, there are natural enemies that control the populations of most pests. These include predators, parasites, and diseases. In fact, spiders kill far more crop-eating insects every year than humans do by using pesticide chemicals. So then we can think about, why do we need so many pesticides then, if spiders do a good job? When we clear forests and grasslands and replace those ecosystems with monoculture farms that are doused with pesticides, we upset many of these natural population checks and balances. Synthetic pesticides are chemicals used to kill or control populations of organisms we might consider to be a pest, such as insects, weeds, and rodents. Common types of pesticides include insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, and rodenticides. And here I have a little photo of an alternative for controlling mice. It's a cat. Some farms have cats, people have cats to control the mice in barns, for example. Since the year 1950, pesticide use has increased more than 50-fold, and most of today's pesticides are 10 to 100 times more toxic than those used in the 1950s. There were different categories of pesticides. There were broad spectrum and selective or narrow spectrum agents. So broad spectrum are toxic to many pests. So it's a broad area, a broad number of pests that are affected. So that's going to include even beneficial species. Examples are chlorinated hydrocarbon compounds such as DDT and organophosphate compounds such as malathion and parathion. Selective or narrow spectrum agents are effective against narrowly defined group of organisms. For example, algicides specifically kill algae, and fungicides specifically kill fungi. But then other organisms may not have an effect. They may not die from the narrow spectrum agents. So it's more of a targeted pesticide. Pesticides vary in their persistence. Persistence is the length of time that pesticides remain deadly in the environment. For example, DDT remains in the environment for years, and it could be biologically magnified in food chains and food webs. In contrast, organophosphates are active for days or weeks and are not biologically magnified. But they could be highly toxic to humans, but they do not persist for extremely long time periods in the environment. In 1962, biologist Rachel Carson warned against relying primarily on synthetic organic chemicals to kill insects and other species that we regard as pests. And there was a book and a film called Silent Spring that you can either watch the film or read the book if you are interested in learning more about that. There are advantages and disadvantages to using synthetic pesticides. And some of these we already talked about, but I want to mention this advantage over here that says save lives. That is by preventing insect-transmitted diseases. For example, dengue fever, malaria, Lyme disease, things like that. So there are advantages to using chemical pesticides, synthetic pesticides. What can you do to reduce exposure to pesticides? You can grow some of your food using organic methods. You can buy certified organic food. Wash and scrub all fresh fruits, vegetables, and wild foods that you pick. Eat less meat, no meat, or certified organically produced meat. And trim the fat from meat. Here is a list of the Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15. The Dirty Dozen is a list of fruits and vegetables that are more likely to contain pesticides. The Clean 15 is a list of fruits and vegetables that is less likely to contain a lot of pesticides. So in order to reduce exposure to pesticides, you can choose more of the Clean 15 as your choices for fruits and vegetables. If you want to eat the Dirty Dozen list or any of those on the Dirty Dozen list, then it is suggested that you get those as organic produce because they tend to contain more pesticides. Pesticide use has not reduced U.S. crop losses to pests. Synthetic pesticide use has not reduced the crop losses because of genetic resistance to pesticides and reduction of natural predators that would otherwise eat the pests. For example, pesticides kill spiders that would otherwise help eat insects that eat crop plants. So this is a wolf spider that is one of many important insect predators. And in here it is going to eat this grasshopper. Grasshoppers are a significant pest for crops. And here is a wasp parasitizing a gypsy moth caterpillar, which is going to eat crops. So this is another example of biological pest control. But when you have insecticides, they're going to kill the wasp and the spider along with the grasshopper and the caterpillar. And regarding the resistance, insect populations can actually develop resistance to pesticides. So here in stage A, you have pesticide application. Most of the insects are affected and die, except for you might have some that naturally were more resistant, and then they mate and have babies, offspring that are resistant. So then the next time you go and spray the same pesticides, you're not really controlling most of the pest population. So eventually, stronger pesticides are needed in order to control resistant insect population that survived the previous pesticide applications. And then we're able to breed and have offspring that are more resistant to that pesticide. And laws and treaties can help protect us from harmful effects of pesticides. In the US, there were 3 federal agencies, the EPA, the USDA, and the FDA, that regulate the sale and use of pesticides under the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. It was first passed in 1947 and amended in 1972. The EPA is supposed to assess the health risks of the active ingredients in synthetic pesticide products that are already in use. However, after more than 30 years, fewer than 10% of the active ingredients in pesticide products have been tested for chronic health effects due to lack of funding. In 1996, Congress passed the Food Quality Protection Act. Due to growing scientific evidence and citizen pressure concerning the effects of small amounts of pesticides on children. The act requires the EPA to reduce the allowed levels of pesticide residues in food by a factor of 10 when there is inadequate information on the potentially harmful effects on children. So that goes along with that precautionary principle that we learned about earlier in the semester. Between 1972 and the year 2010, the EPA used the FIFRA to ban and restrict the use of 64 active pesticide ingredients, including DDT. That brings us to the end of chapter 10 on soil and food. Thank you for watching and listening, and go think about what you're going to have to eat.